Section 23 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Bourgeois Doyle. The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 4. Translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 23. The Story of the Three Sharpers and the Sultan. Story of the Sisters and the Sultana, their mother, Part 2. The ship was soon ready, and being laden with every necessary for the accommodation of his family, also rich presents for the friendly Sultan who had afforded them protection, sailed with a favorable wind, and speedily arrived at the desired haven. The commander of the vessel was welcomely received by the Sultan, who issued orders for his entertainment and that of his whole crew at the royal cost. And at the expiration of 3 days, the Sultana and her daughters, being anxious to return home after so long an absence, and that so unfortunate, took leave and embarked. The Sultan made them valuable presents, and the wind being fair, they set sail. For 3 days the weather was propitious, but on the evening of the last a contrary gale arose, when they cast anchor and lowered their topmasts. At length the storm increased to such violence that the anchor parted, and the masts fell overboard, and the crew gave themselves over for lost. The vessel was driven about at the mercy of the tempest till midnight, all on board weeping and wailing, when at length she struck upon the rocks and went to pieces. Such of the crew whose deaths were decreed perished, and those whose longer life was predestined escaped ashore, some on planks, some on chests, and some on the broken timbers of the ship, but all separated from each other. The Sultana mother was tossed about till daylight on a plank, when she was perceived by the commander of the vessel, who with 3 of his crew had taken to the ship's boat. He took her in, and after 3 days' rowing they reached a mountainous coast, on which they landed and advanced into the country. They had not proceeded far when they perceived a great dust, which clearing up displayed an approaching army. To their joyful surprise it proved to be that of the Sultan, who after the departure of the vessel, dreading lest an accident might happen, had marched in hopes of reaching the city where they were before his wife and daughters should sail, in order to conduct them home by land. It is impossible to describe the meeting of the Sultan and his consort, but their joy was clouded by the absence of their daughters and the dreadful uncertainty of their fate. When the first raptures of meeting were over, they wept together, and exclaimed, "We are from God, and to God we must return." After 40 days' march they arrived at their capital, but continually regretting the princesses, saying, "Alas, alas, most probably they have been drowned, but even should they have escaped ashore, perhaps they may have been separated, and what calamities may have befallen them." Constantly did they bemoan together in this manner, immersed in grief, and taking no pleasure in the enjoyments of life. The young princess, after struggling with the waves till almost exhausted, was fortunately cast ashore on a pleasant coast, where she found some excellent fruits and clear fresh water. Being revived, she reposed herself a while, and then walked from the beach into the country. But she had not proceeded far when a young man on horseback, with some dogs following him, met her, and upon hearing that she had just escaped shipwreck, mounted her before him, and having conveyed her to his house, committed her to the care of his mother. She received her with compassionate kindness, and during a whole month assiduously attended her, till by degrees she recovered her health and beauty. The young man was legal heir to the kingdom, but his succession had been wrested from him by a usurper, who, however, dying soon after the arrival of the princess, he was reinstated in his rights and placed on the throne, when he offered her his hand. "But," she said, "how can I think of marriage while I know not the condition of my unfortunate family, or enjoy repose while my mother and sisters are perhaps suffering misery? When I have intelligence of their welfare, I will be grateful to my deliverer." The young Sultan was so much in love with the princess that the most distant hope gave him comfort, and he endeavored to wait patiently her pleasure. But the nobles of the country were anxious to see him wedded, he being the last of his race, and importuned him to marry. He promised to conform to their wishes, but much time elapsing, they became importunate and discontented, when his mother, dreading a rebellion, earnestly entreated the princess to consent to a union as the only measure that could prevent disturbances. The princess, who really loved her preserver, was unwilling to endanger the safety of one to whom she owed such important obligations, and at length consented, when the marriage was celebrated with the greatest pomp and rejoicings. At the expiration of 3 years, the Sultana was delivered of 2 sons, whose birth added to the felicity of the union. The second princess, after being long driven about by the waves upon a plank, was at length cast on shore near a large city, which she entered, and was fortunately compassionated by a venerable matron, who invited her into her house, and adopted her as a daughter in the room of her own, who had lately died. Here she soon recovered her health and beauty. It chanced that the Sultan of this city, who was much beloved for his gentle government and liberality, was taken ill, and notwithstanding the skill of the most celebrated physicians, daily became worse, insomuch that his life was despaired of, to the general grief of the people. The princess, having heard her venerable protectress lament the danger of the Sultan, said, "My dear mother, I will prepare a dish of pottage, which, if you will carry to the Sultan, he can be prevailed upon to eat it, will, by the blessing of Allah, recover him from his disorder." "I fear," replied the matron, "I shall hardly be allowed admittance to the palace, much less to present him with the pottage." "You can but try," answered the princess, "and even the attempt at a good action is acceptable to God." "Well," rejoined the old woman, "prepare your pottage, my dear daughter, and I will endeavor to get admission." The princess prepared the dish of pottage, composed of various minerals, herbs, and perfumes, and when it was ready, the old woman took it to the Sultan's palace. The guards and eunuchs inquired what she had brought, when she said, "A dish of pottage, which I request you will present to the Sultan, and beg him to eat as much of it as he can, for by God's help it will restore him to health." The eunuchs introduced her into the chamber of their sick sovereign, when the old woman, taking off the cover of the dish, such a grateful perfume exhaled from the contents as revived his spirits. Being informed what the venerable matron had brought, he thanked her and tasted the pottage, which was so agreeably flavored that he ate part of it with an appetite to which he had been long a stranger. He then presented the bearer with a purse of dinars. When she returned home, informed the princess of her welcome reception and of the present she had received. The Sultan had no sooner eaten part of the pottage than he felt an inclination to repose, and sunk into a refreshing sleep, which lasted for some hours. On his awakening, he found himself wonderfully revived, and having a desire afresh to eat, finished the whole. He now wished for more, and inquired after the old woman, but none of his attendants could inform him where she lived. However, in the evening she brought another mess, which the princess had prepared, and the Sultan ate it with renewed appetite. After which, though before quite helpless, he was now able to sit up and even to walk. He inquired of the old woman if it was her own preparation, to which she replied, "No, my lord, but my daughter dressed it, and entreated me to bring it." The Sultan exclaimed, "She cannot be thy own daughter, as her skill shows her of much higher quality." He then made her a present and requested that she would bring him every morning a fresh supply, to which she said, "To hear is to obey," and retired. The princess sent regularly for 7 mornings successively a dish of pottage, and the Sultan as regularly presented her adopted mother with a purse of dinars, for such was the rapidity of his recovery. And at the expiration of the 6th day he was perfectly well, and on the 7th he mounted his horse and repaired to his country palace to make the absolution of health and enjoy fresh air. During her visits he had questioned the old lady concerning her adopted daughter, and she so described her beauty, virtues, and accomplishments that his heart was smitten, and he became anxious to see her. The Sultan, in order to gratify his curiosity, disguised himself one day in the habit of a dervish, and repairing to the house of the old woman, knocked at the door. On being questioned what he wanted, he replied, "I am a wandering dervish, a stranger in this city, and distressed with hunger." The old woman, being fearful of admitting an unknown person, would have sent him away, but the princess exclaimed, "Hospitality to strangers is incumbent upon us, especially to the religious poor." Upon this he was admitted, and the princess, having seated him respectfully, set victuals before him, of which he ate till he was satisfied, and having washed, rose up, thanked the old woman and her supposed daughter for their bounty, and retired. But his sight was fascinated with her beauty, and his heart devoted to her love. The Sultan, on his return to the palace, sent for the old woman, and on her arrival presented her with a rich dress and valuable jewels, desiring that she would give them to her daughter and prevail upon her to put them on. The old lady promised obedience, and as she walked homeward, said to herself, "If this adopted daughter of mine is wise, she will comply with the Sultan's desires and put on the dress, but if she does not, I will expel her from my house." When she reached home, she displayed the superb habit and the dazzling ornaments, but the princess at first refused to accept them, till at length, moved by the entreaties of her protectress, whom she could not disoblige, she put them on, and the old lady was delighted with her appearance. The Sultan, who had slipped on a female dress, having covered himself with a close veil, followed the old woman to her house and listened at the door to know if the daughter would accept his present. When he found that she had put on the dress, he was overcome with rapture, and hastening back to his palace, sent again for the old lady, to whom he signified his wish to marry her daughter. When the princess was informed of the offer, she consented, and the Sultan, attended by a splendid cavalcade, conducted her that evening to his palace, where the Qazi united them in marriage. A general feast was made for all the inhabitants of the city for 7 days successively, and the Sultan and the princess enjoyed the height of felicity. In the course of 5 years, the Almighty blessed them with a son and 2 daughters. The eldest princess on the wreck of the ship, having clung to a piece of timber, was, after much distress, floated on shore, where she found a man's habit, and thinking it a safe disguise for the protection of her honor, she dressed herself in it, and proceeded to a city which appeared near the coast. On her entrance, she was accosted by a maker of cotton wallets for traveling, who, observing that she was a stranger and supposing her a man, asked if she would live with him, as he wanted an assistant. Being glad to secure any asylum, she accepted this offer of maintenance and daily wages of half a dirham. He conducted her to his house and treated her with kindness. The next day she entered upon her business, and so neat was the work she executed that in a short time her master's shop was more frequented than any other. It happened that the shop was situated near the palace of the Sultan. One morning the princess, his daughter, looking through the lattice of a balcony, beheld the seeming young man at work, with the sleeves of his vest drawn up to his shoulder. His arms were white and polished as silver, and his countenance brilliant as the sun unobscured by the clouds. The daughter of the Sultan was captivated in the snare of love. The Sultan's daughter continued gazing at the supposed young man till he withdrew from work, when she retired to her apartment. But so much was she fascinated by his charms that she became restless, and at length indisposed. Her nurse attended her, felt her pulse, and asked her several questions, but could find no symptoms of bodily illness upon her. She said, "My dear daughter, I am convinced that nothing has afflicted thee but desire of some youth with whom thou art in love." The princess exclaimed, "My dear mother, as thou hast discovered my secret, thou wilt, I trust, not only keep it sacred, but bring to me the man I love." The nurse replied, "No one can keep a secret closer than myself, so that you may safely confide it to my care." The princess then said, "Mother, my heart is captivated by the young man who works in the shop opposite my windows, and if I cannot meet him, I shall die of grief." The nurse replied, "My dear mistress, he is the most beautiful youth of the age, and the women of the whole city are distracted with his charms, yet he is so bashful as to answer no advances, and shrinks from notice like a schoolboy, but I will endeavor to overcome his shyness and procure you a meeting." Having said thus, she went immediately to the wallet maker's, and giving him a piece of gold, desired he would let his assistant accompany her home with 2 of his best wallets. The man was pleased with her generosity, and selecting his choicest manufacture, commanded his journeyman to accompany the nurse. The old woman led the disguised princess through bypaths to a private passage of the palace, and introduced her into the apartment of the daughter of the Sultan, who received her supposed beloved with emotions of joy too violent to be concealed. Pretending to admire the goods, she asked some questions, and giving him 20 pieces of gold, desired him to return with more goods on the following evening, to which the seeming journeyman replied, "To hear is to obey." The disguised princess, on her return home, delivered the 20 pieces of gold to her employer, who was alarmed and inquired from whence they came. Upon which she informed him of her adventure, when the wallet maker was in greater terror than before, and said to himself, "If this intrigue goes on, the Sultan will discover it. I shall be put to death, and my family ruined on account of this young man and his follies." He then besought him not to repeat his visit, but he answered, "I cannot forbear, though I dread my death may be the consequence." In short, the disguised princess went every evening with the old nurse to the apartments of the Sultan's daughter, till at length the Sultan one night suddenly entered, and perceiving he supposed a man with the princess, commanded him to be seized and bound hand and foot. The Sultan then sent for an executioner, resolved to put the culprit to death. The executioner, on his arrival, seized the disguised princess. But what was the surprise of all present when, on taking off the turban and vest, they discovered her sex. The Sultan commanded her to be conducted to his harem, and inquired her story, when, having no resource but the truth, she related her adventures. When the princess had informed the Sultan of the treachery of the vizier, and the consequent conduct of her father, the distress of her mother, her sisters, and herself, their being relieved, and her escape from shipwreck, with what had happened since, he was filled with wonder and compassion, and ordered his daughter to accommodate her in the harem. The love of the latter was now changed to sincere friendship, and under her care and attentions the unfortunate princess in a few months recovered her former beauty. It chanced that the Sultan, visiting his daughter, was fascinated with the charms of the princess, but unwilling to infringe the rules of hospitality, concealed his love, till at length he became dangerously ill, when the daughter, suspecting the matter, prevailed upon him to reveal the cause of his complaint. She then informed her friend and entreated her to accept her father in marriage, but the princess said, at the same time weeping bitterly, "Misfortune hath separated me from my family. I know not whether my sisters, my father, and my mother are living, and if so, what is their condition? How can I be happy or merry while they are perhaps involved in misery?" The daughter of the Sultan did not refrain from comforting the unfortunate princess, at the same time representing the hopeless condition of her father, till at length she consented to the marriage. This joyful intelligence speedily revived the lovelorn Sultan, and the nuptials were celebrated with the utmost joy and magnificence. The aged Sultan and Sultana continued to lament the loss of their daughters for some years, when at length the former resolved to travel in search of them, and having left the government in charge of his wife, departed, attended only by his vizier. They both assumed the habit of dervishes, and after a month's uninterrupted traveling reached a large city extending along the sea-coast, close upon which the Sultan of it had erected a magnificent pleasure-house, where the pretended dervishes beheld him sitting in one of the pavilions with his 2 sons, one 6 and the other 7 years old. They approached, made their obeisance, and uttered a long invocation, agreeably to the usage of the religious, for his prosperity. The Sultan returned their compliment, desired them to be seated, and having conversed with them till evening, dismissed them with a present, when they repaired to the caravanserai and hired an apartment. On the following day, after amusing themselves with viewing the city, they again repaired to the beach, and saw the Sultan sitting with his children as before. While they were admiring the beauty of the structure, the younger prince, impelled by an unaccountable impulse, came up to them, gazed eagerly at them, and when they retired followed them to their lodging, which they did not perceive till he had entered with them and sat down. The old sultan was astonished at the child's behavior, took him in his arms, kissed him and fondled him, and after which he desired him to return to his parents. But the boy insisted upon staying, and remained 4 days, during which the pretended dervishes did not stir from their caravanserai. The sultan, missing his son, supposed that he had gone to his mother, and she imagined that he was still with his father. But on the latter entering the harem, the loss was discovered. Messengers were dispatched every way, but no tidings of the boy could be obtained. The miserable parents now supposed that he had fallen into the sea and was drowned. Nets were dragged and divers employed for 3 days, but in vain. On the 5th day, orders were issued to search every house in the city, when the infant prince was at length discovered at the caravanserai in the apartment of the pretended dervishes, who were ignominiously dragged before the sultan. The sultan was transported with joy at the recovery of his son, but supposing the dervishes had meant to steal him away, he ordered them instantly to be put to death. The executioners seized them, bound their hands behind them, and were going to strike, when the child with loud cries ran up and, clinging to the knees of the elder victim, could not be forced away. The sultan was astonished, and ordering the execution for the present to be delayed, went and informed the mother of the child of his wonderful behavior. The sultana, on hearing it, was no less surprised than the sultan, and felt a curiosity to hear from the dervish himself on what account he had enticed away her son. She said, "It is truly extraordinary that the boy should express such affection for a strange dervish. Send for him to your closet and order him to relate his adventures, to which I will listen from behind a curtain." The sultan sent for the supposed dervish, and commanding all his attendants to retire, withdrew with him into his closet and desired him to be seated. After which he said, "Wicked dervish, what could have induced thee to entice away my son or to visit my kingdom?" He replied, "Heaven knows, O Sultan, I did not entice him. The boy followed me to my lodging, when I said, 'My son, return to thy father,' but he would not, and I remained in continual dread till what was decreed occurred." The Sultan was softened, spoke kindly to him, and begged him to relate his adventures, when the pretended dervish wept and said, "My history is a wonderful one. I had a friend whom I left as my agent and guardian to my family while I was performing a pilgrimage to Mecca, but had scarcely left my house 10 days, when accidentally seeing my wife, he endeavored to debauch her, and sent an old woman with a rich present to declare his adulterous love. My wife was enraged, and put the infamous messenger to death. He sent a second and a third, whom she also killed. These last words were scarcely spoken when the Sultana, bursting from her concealment, ran up to the dervish, fell upon his neck, and embraced him. Upon which the Sultan, her husband, was enraged, and put his hand to his scimitar, and exclaimed, "What means this shameless behavior?" The Sultana, at once laughing and crying with rapture, informed him that the supposed dervish was her father, upon which the Sultan also fell at his feet and welcomed him. He then ordered the other dervish, his vizier, to be released, commanded royal robes to be brought for his father-in-law, and a suite of apartments in the palace to be prepared for his reception, with an attendance befitting his dignity. When the old sultan had spent some time with his youngest daughter, thus happily recovered, he became anxious to search after the others, and signified his intention of departing. But his son-in-law declared that he would accompany him on the expedition with a number of his nobles, and an army, lest some fatal accident might occur from his being unattended. Preparations were accordingly made for march. The two sultans encamped without the city, and in a few days began their expedition, which proved successful to their wishes. The aged monarch, having recovered his children, retired to his own kingdom, where he reigned prosperously till the angel of death summoned him to paradise. End of section 23.